But until now, he did not know what it felt like to be the subject of 17 investigations. And he's certainly tweeting like a man who doesn't feel lucky. He's tweeting like a panicked president. Think about those words together. A president of the United States who is panicking, a panicked president. But Donald Trump's strategy to try to prove to the world that he is not panicking is to send the strangest presidential lawyer in history on TV to say profoundly strange things. Here is Rudy Giuliani trying to say that the president will not agree to an interview with the special prosecutor. But is that what he actually ends up saying?
You're saying no way, no interview.
They're a joke over my dead body, but, you know, I could be dead.
I could be dead. If your rhetorical skills are so limited that you find yourself using the over my dead body construction to express your opposition to something, or just how unlikely it is that something will happen, you are never supposed to end that with, I could be dead. That's the Giuliani touch. That's the Giuliani magic. It's his way of saying, I have no idea what I'm saying. It took 170 years for Alan Bennett's brilliant play, The Madness of George III, to arrive in London after the reign of King George III ended. It took 170 years for London to sit down and take a good, hard look at the madness of King George. Future Alan Bennetts, writing about the Trump era, will be delivering the madness of Donald Trump to a Broadway stage much more quickly. And surely there will be a dramatist, or many, who find the gold in the madness of Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani will continue to be interviewed on television, and he will continue to create more problems for the president by saying things like Donald Trump was pursuing a deal to build a Trump Tower in Moscow all the way through the end of the presidential election campaign. That statement was even more incriminating of Donald Trump than Michael Cohen's previous statement that he and Donald Trump were pursuing a deal in Moscow up to June of the campaign year. That was incriminating enough. President Trump has the most inadequate team of presidential defense lawyers in history. They are mostly inexperienced, and there's only a few of them, just a small handful. And when they started, they thought their job was defending the president in one investigation. Now there are 17 investigations. We're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need a bigger boat for all the lawyers Donald Trump really needs to defend him in these investigations. He needs a minimum of 17 lawyers. That's just minimum. And when the congressional investigations start next year, when the Democrats take over the House of Representatives, Donald Trump is going to need a lot more lawyers, a lot more. House Republicans had their final day of fun with former FBI Director James Comey today in a closed-door hearing that clearly infuriated James Comey, who spoke to reporters as soon as it was over.
What impact does it have when the president calls Michael Cohen a rat, someone who's cooperating with an investigation, and questions how his office was raided by the FBI?
It undermines the rule of law. This is the president of the United States calling a witness who has cooperated with his own Justice Department a rat. Say that again to yourself at home and remind yourself where we have ended up. This is not about Republicans and Democrats. This is about what does it mean to be an American? What are the things that we care about above our policy disputes, which are important? There's a set of values that represent the glue of this country, and they are under attack by things just like that. We have to stop being numb to it. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, you need to stand on your feet, overcome your shame, and say something.
Leading off our discussion now, Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor, Mimi Rocah, former federal prosecutor, and Jennifer Rubin, an opinion writer at The Washington Post. They are all MSNBC contributors. And Joyce Vance, I want to get your reaction to what James Comey had to say today.
I think Comey hits the nail on the head, and it's surprising to those of us who had the opportunity to work with him a little bit when he was inside of the Justice Department to see him so upset, because he's someone who's always very measured in his tone. He was obviously incensed by what he sees as the diminishment of the rule of law in this regard. One of the things that's always made this country work something that works inside of DOJ is that people who might disagree about politics agree upon principles. And one of those principles is the rule of law. Now we have the president undermining the rule of law from the White House, and it doesn't matter what political party you identify with, we should all be outraged by that.
Jennifer Rubin, I'm beginning to wonder if the Trump use of Giuliani strategy is to suggest to the world that Donald Trump is not the craziest person in Washington, that there's another one. And doesn't Donald Trump look sane by comparison to Rudy Giuliani?
And smart, too. Right. It is a mystery to me why he goes out there and, as you say, says more incriminating things and admits, well, he didn't, maybe he did. Well, if he did, it isn't a crime. He's done that multiple times now. So I don't know what purpose he is serving, other than entertaining, perhaps, Donald Trump. He certainly isn't representing him in any context. But the wonderful thing about it is we've reached that stage where what Rudy Giuliani says doesn't matter at all. It matters what the facts are. It matters what the law is. It matters what the Southern District of New York and what the state investigators in New York, another investigation, and what Robert Mueller and his team have. It's down to law and facts and judges, and Rudy Giuliani just doesn't matter.
Yeah, and Mimi, it's really striking that you could say that legitimately about a presidential lawyer. Giuliani's function now, it strikes me, is purely entertainment. It's purely just to supply little things for me to use in these kinds of scripts and for others to use. What he says has nothing to do with the president's case, has nothing to do with what's going to happen next. Everyone knows that a Giuliani interview is just an utterly ridiculous exercise, and yet we will, I'm sure, continue to have them. I've just never seen a lawyer used this way or perform this way in any situation.
Well, he hasn't been acting like a lawyer. He's been acting really as a PR person. And to be fair,
the worst PR person ever.
Now, although to be fair, I think we all were acknowledging that to some extent, before the facts really started coming out, to Jennifer's point, the Giuliani-Trump strategy of trying to smear Mueller and call it a witch hunt were having some impact. I mean, none of us agreed with it or bought it, but it seemed to have some impact. It worked until the facts started coming out. Now they are coming out. And I don't think we've seen even, the tip of the iceberg or whatever metaphor you want to use. And you can't fight facts and evidence with that kind of spin and PR strategy. I mean, for example, yesterday, Giuliani said that there was Flynn was a perjury trap. He was still saying that yesterday. Even by the brief, you knew that wasn't true. Now we have the 302. If that was a perjury trap, it was the worst trap I've ever seen laid, because they were giving him every opportunity to tell the truth, and he just wouldn't do it. So, again, what he says has no basis in fact.
Yeah. Joyce, the 302, of course, are the FBI interview reports of Michael Flynn that became public today, in which we see exactly how the interviews went and the sequence and how many chances Michael Flynn was given to correct the record. What was your reading of those FBI reports that were released today?
So, of course, we don't know for certain why Judge Sullivan ordered the FBI, ordered the Justice Department to take the unusual step of releasing these 302s. They're heavily redacted, but even with that, releasing 302s is very unusual. They're reports of interview that FBI agents make near to the time that they undertake that interview. And once you read this 302, it's just abundantly clear that Flynn was appropriately charged with lying to the government. They, as Mimi says, give him every opportunity to tell the truth, and he simply resists at every turn, lying when the truth would perhaps have served him better. The 302s are just a stunning confirmation of the reason that Flynn had to plead guilty in this case. He's guilty.
Yeah, and Jennifer, this is something that Flynn has brought on, and through this sentencing process, we weren't necessarily going to see these if Flynn wasn't trying to suggest through his lawyers that he was somehow taken advantage of, wasn't phrasing it anything like Donald Trump with the crazy perjury trap language, but he did seem to be trying to get some kind of sympathy from the judge by being somehow taken advantage of by FBI agents.
He does, and he did. And it's absurd on its face. He was a general in the United States military. And if anybody understands that when FBI agents come to your office and interview you, you better tell the truth, it would be an ex-general, I would think. Moreover, it was clear from the interview that they are asking specific questions. This is not just, hey, have a beer, let's talk about the family, how are the kids. This is a straightforward interview. They go back again and again, asking him about his contacts. At one point, the agents even say, didn't you have some conversation about the UN? And Flynn, without missing a beat, says, oh, good reminder, because he's been caught in one lie. But he lies again. He says, well, we didn't really tell them not to do anything. We didn't tell them anything about sanctions, which, again, was a lie on top of a lie. So he has brought this on himself, just like he has brought himself immense shame by representing the government of Turkey while he is advising a presidential candidate in the transition and has been named to be the national security advisor while he is representing the government of Turkey. That is absurd. And we've never seen behavior like this, really, in my lifetime, perhaps in the lifetime of the country, and not with a military person. You know, politicians, perhaps I hold to a lower standard, but military men representing in secret a foreign government?
And some of his associates now indicted in that representation of Turkey.
Yeah, and look, Flynn could have been indicted in that. I mean, that is clear.
In the new indictment today. Yeah.
Yes, and so I think now when we look at Flynn's cooperation, you know, before everyone said, oh, look, Mueller's recommending, you know, jail time. He must be providing very valuable information, and that was true. I think now that is tenfold true because this is a very serious indictment that he.
And Flynn is clearly an informer on this indictment of his associates.
Clearly cooperating, but I don't think that he would be getting all of this credit just for cooperating against his associates, who really are somewhat lower on the totem pole.
Right.
So the question still is out there, and I think now we know it's, you know, of who and what has he given information on. I think it's bigger than him, it's bigger than this. And I think the question still remains of why he lied about that phone call or many conversations with Kislyak, because he had to know he was recorded. And so my sense is, as reading the 302, is that he didn't want to say yes, because then he would have had to explain more about why he had those conversations with Kislyak. And so there's more other conversations that were going on behind the scenes that he didn't want to have to be asked about.
Yeah, and Joyce, it's so stunning to read this because you see the FBI agents reminding him, saying, well, what about this? They clearly know. He can tell in the conversation that they know the truthful answers to the questions that he's not answering truthfully.
You know, as the interview went on longer and longer, it has to have become clear to him at some point that they knew everything that he had been lying to them about. There's one interesting detail in the 302 that's released, and we learned that Flynn was actually on a trip to the Dominican Republic with his wife when he had this phone conversation with Kislyak. Perhaps he was on a scrambled channel, but for whatever reason, he believed that his conversation with the Russian ambassador was not monitored. Unfortunately for him, that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Joyce Vance, Mimi Rocah, Jennifer Rubin, thank you all for joining us tonight. And when we come back, how Russia helped Donald Trump suppress the vote in 2016. How Russia helped Donald Trump win the Electoral College. And later, what could be a disturbing trend for President Trump that began in the United States Senate today? Donald Trump is both the President of the United States and the leader of the party that believes it cannot survive without voter suppression.
They didn't come out to vote for Hillary. They didn't come out. And that was the big. So thank you to the African American community. And the African American community was great to us. They came through big league. Big league. And frankly, if they had any doubt, they didn't vote. And that was almost as good.
The bipartisan members of the Senate Intelligence Committee have released 2 reports today showing that Russia's attack on our presidential election included an attack on African-American voters trying to suppress their vote. According to one of the reports, in the days leading up to the election, Russia's Internet Research Agency began to deploy voter suppression tactics on the black community targeted account. The suppression narratives were targeted almost exclusively at the black community on Instagram and Facebook. Here's Sherilyn Ifill, head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, with Chris Hayes earlier tonight.
African Americans have to deal with the challenge of voter suppression that is, that comes at us from state and local governments, and since the Trump election, even from the federal government. Now what we're learning is that we have to face voter suppression efforts by foreign governments.
Joining our discussion now, Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration, and Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com. Both are MSNBC contributors. And Jason, your reaction to these two reports and the targeting of black voters?
I'm not surprised, Lawrence. I mean, this has been going on for a while. You have prominent members of Black Twitter who have said for years that you had these sort of hostile bots that were going after active feminists, going after members of the community and sort of sowing discord. But I think it's important to remember that as much as Russia may have tried to exploit existing racial divisions in the country, they were existing racial divisions. Hillary Clinton had her own problems with black people. The Russians did not make her say super predators. The Russians did not make Bernie Sanders say all lives matter at Netroots Nation in 2015. So I think the important thing to remember is, as problematic as foreign intervention is, it is a reflection of pre-existing problems, and Democrats need to be aware of that heading into 2020 to not let this happen again.
Let's take a look at one of the memes that the Russians put out there in social media. It's about voter discouragement. It's about trying to grab onto those elements, those attachment points that Jason was just mentioning, and just in every way they possibly can, discouraging the black vote from turning out. Rick Stengel, when you were Undersecretary of State, one of your jobs was to monitor social media around the world for terrorism, trying to counter terrorism influences on social media. But did you reach over into what the Russians were doing?
Yes, we started the first counter-Russian disinformation unit at the State Department based on what we saw the Russians doing around the annexation of Crimea, going on social media.
So well before the presidential election.
2014, the spring of 2014, we saw that. We saw a kind of tsunami of Russian disinformation and propaganda about what they were doing in Crimea and Ukraine, that they were uniting it. It was part of Russia. So we saw that on social media. I argue in my book that this is a template for what they did in 2016. It was much more successful than they thought it was going to be and much easier than they thought it to be. So the Internet Research Agency, which has been mentioned, 55 Savushkina Street in St. Petersburg, that's where it is. It's a troll factory. Hundreds of people go in and every day creating content, using bots, using persona. That's what they did to try to suppress the black vote in the election.
Yeah, and Jason, it looks like a scattershot approach, but that's the way social media works. You just fire it out there in every conceivable venue that you possibly can.
Right, and there's a long history of this. Terrell Starr at The Root, Monique Judge at The Root, they've been writing about this for years. I mean, this goes back to the 1960s. The Russians have always seen America's sort of multicultural population as one of the weak points that they could attack us on. They used to approach black activists in the 60s saying, this country will never love you, give us information. Like, this is not new. Social media is just a modern version of it. What I question is this, though. I don't know that this method was necessarily going to be successful if you didn't have the candidates on the table that you had. I don't know that this will work against a Beto O'Rourke. I don't know that this will work against a Joe Biden in 2020. There are lots of different reasons why people choose not to vote. I don't know that I think that these memes were a driving force as much as the people who are running for office.
Yeah, and Rick Stengel, when you look at what they were doing, David Axelrod, who ran 2 successful presidential campaigns for Barack Obama, said today the Trump margin in the Electoral College was so tiny, the way he picked off these small clusters of votes in a couple of states, that this is the kind of thing that could have turned that.
Yes, it's impossible to know. I mean, the thing about the Russians is they're not very creative. They don't create content out of nothing. What they do is they increase sentiment. So what they were trying to do in those places, in those industrial states, increase sentiment for Trump voters to come out and decrease sentiment for Hillary voters to come out. We're not very good at measuring how the internet changes people's minds, but we are pretty good at knowing about whether they increase enthusiasm or decrease it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Jason, we saw the graph showing that the black voter turnout decreased in 2016. First time it's decreased since 1996.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to put down a list, Lawrence, I would say first it was the Voting Rights Act, then a suppression that you had in Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina. And I think what a key thing about what the Russia was successful at doing is it ratcheted up white racial anxiety. Because the same way that they were promoting memes in the black community saying, hey, don't vote for these people, and Black Lives Matter tells you no, they were pushing out those same extreme memes in the white community saying black people are going to attack, black people are going to take over. So I think there's a sort of synchronicity. There's an organic way that these sorts of things work together. I think the lack of black turnout, though, could probably be pushed primarily to voter suppression. But I really do wonder going forward, depending on what happens in this country, how effective this is. But I wouldn't doubt that the Russians will simply change to another population, the LGBT community, the Latino community. Racism is always going to be in play in American politics. They'll find some other crease in our society to exploit.
Well, yeah, the Republicans.
In fact, they have. I mean, if you look at the report today, they were what they are always trying to do is sow dissent. They're always trying to make the American people feel like the government is not legitimate. So not only did they target black voters, in the report today they targeted LGBT voters, they targeted other people who might be unsympathetic towards the status quo. It's not like they're sympathetic with African Americans or anything like that. They're trying to sow dissent.
But Jason, obviously the Republicans, most importantly, did everything they possibly could to suppress the black vote everywhere they possibly could influence that in any way, including reducing polling places, all sorts of things they could do. And then the Russians come in and try to make that vote a bit more reluctant. So if it's become extremely difficult for you to vote, and now you have this Russian social media saying, voting's not that important, those two things taken together could factor in.
Yeah, and also I think we can't forget also the illegal things that Russia was doing of taking people's IDs and starting fake organizations amongst black people to discourage people from voting. I mean, I saw those kinds of memes amongst my very same students, information that wasn't true about Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And the problem that what I really am concerned about is when this is connected in the future, they're going to get more sophisticated. They're going to have people assist them. And when they start putting out false information, if we're not vigilant, if Facebook isn't vigilant, if Twitter isn't vigilant, this is the kind of information that moves faster than you can stop it. And that's what concerns me about black voters. That's what concerns me about anybody, because we already see the voter suppression is not going to stop, and we know that the Russians aren't going to stop by 2020 either.
Rick Stengel and Jason Johnson, thank you both for joining us on this subject. And we're going to have much more still ahead, including what Donald Trump now has to fear from some Republican senators. But first, we have some great news about your generosity this weekend. Since you heard Fanny Chimwa tell you on Friday night how important the Kind Fund Scholarship has been to her education, now that she's a freshman at Chancellor College in Malawi, you have contributed another $182,758. That brings the total that we have raised for the Kind Fund in the 8 years since this program began to just over $19 million. And as most of you know, that money is used to build desks at factories in Malawi and deliver those desks to schools that don't have any desks, and also to provide scholarships for girls to attend high school. We have a very long way to go to deliver desks to every school in Malawi and to be able to fund every student who needs scholarships to attend high school. And so your continued generosity remains hugely important. Yesterday, Jane Edith Wilson tweeted this: bake sale for the Kind Fund underway in Larchmont Village. 4th year my son has organized out here with his best friend. Lots of treats. Thanks again, Lawrence, for inspiring the kids. Los Angeles, MSNBC. Hey, Jane, I was on the other side of town in L.A. yesterday. If I had known about this, I would have been there. So let me know next year. You can donate to the Kind Fund in any amount. You can make a contribution to anyone on your holiday gift list, and UNICEF will send them an acknowledgement of your gift. You can donate at lastworddesks.msnbc.com. I thank you, and the students thank you. Tomorrow, members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus will travel to the southern border to investigate the circumstances of the death of 7-year-old Jacqueline Ame Rosemary Cal Makin, who died in custody of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. BuzzFeed reports that the Department of Homeland Security is refusing to allow the members of Congress to question the border agents involved in that case. Cal Perry has been reporting for us from the border, where he found children and their parents marked with numbers on their arms while they wait to be processed. And joining us now is NBC News correspondent Cal Perry with his exclusive reporting from both sides of the border. And Cal, there's a report tonight of members of Congress at the southern border tonight trying to deal with people who are seeking asylum.
This is the crossing near San Diego, south of San Diego. We're talking about Otay Mesa, California. There's a bit of a standoff happening right now in Southern California. 2 members of Congress passed into Mexico to bring 15 Honduran migrants back across the border. They crossed into the U.S. They were stopped by Customs and Border Protection. Customs and Border Protection said, we are full. We do not have the capacity to process these migrants through. They are now in a 10 by 10 area being held. The members of Congress, along with immigration attorneys, are waving wildly towards Mexican authorities to try to get them to cross. We have the video. We were able to speak to the immigration attorney, and there it is. These individuals are in America. By law, they should be able to apply for asylum. They are not being able to do so. We are seeing this across the country. We've seen it in the past few months, specifically in the El Paso area. While this is new in San Diego, we've been seeing this in El Paso. And what we're seeing in El Paso are people being stopped on the Mexican side of the border, not allowed to cross into the U.S., being held in migrant shelters in Juarez, which is a very dangerous city. And what we're noticing is that it's having a negative impact on children especially.
Bienvenidos.
In a nondescript building in downtown El Paso, Ruben Garcia is welcoming yet another busload of migrants, just processed and released from ICE custody.
Ya están libres. Que ya no están con la migra. Okay?
He's the director of Annunciation House, a group of volunteers providing shelter and food for thousands of migrants a week. Garcia is always asking for more support.
The phenomena of migration, the refugees coming in, is not an El Paso problem. It is a problem of the United States.
Those who made it this far are lucky.
Hello, hola ma. Aquí te habla Luis. Hello. Aquí ya estuvo, mamá. Ya estoy fuera de peligro, ya. Ya estoy fuera de peligro. Ya aquí me trajeron en un lugar bonito. Aquí estoy con mi hijo.
On this day, Garcia explains a process that he calls metering, a controversial way of controlling the number allowed to claim asylum each day.
CBP has started stationing officers right at the international line at the top of the bridges and asking for ID. If you're a refugee, they're pushing you back into Mexico.
To learn more, we travel from El Paso to Casa de Migrante in Juarez, Mexico. It's a 30-minute drive, but for migrants seeking asylum, it's still a world away.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how you
It's good to see you.
Dylan Corbett from the Hope Border Institute works closely with Father Javier Cavillo. They care for some 250 migrants at a time in the center.
So this is a place that receives migrants from all countries, every nationality, but it's a place where their human dignity is respected.
Numbers are marked by Mexican volunteers, ensuring a place in line. The desire to breathe free in America is real, but parents' sacrifices come at a price.
I don't want to separate from my son.
Is that his biggest fear?
¿Es tu temor más grande? Yes, it is.
In this center, are people talking about this with their kids? What are they telling their kids?
Es algo que se conversa acá en la separación de las familias. That's what folks are talking about right now. They're worried that they're going to be separated from their child, but they say they really don't know what's going to happen.
For some, this is about the fabric of America.
Me llamo Beto O'Rourke, mucho gusto. This is a defining American issue. 242 years and counting. We are the strongest, most successful country on the face of the planet, precisely because we are a country of asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants. We lose that at our peril.
Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke isn't the only one on a collision course with the current administration.
People have to understand that asking for asylum is legal. These are not criminals. These people are not dangerous to our community. These are the most vulnerable. of the most vulnerable. And so the American thing to do, consistent with our values, consistent with our ideals as a country, is to welcome them.
After months on the road with the American dream in sight, these migrants who know the uncertainty ahead are allowing hope to prevail over fear.
These are folks who have hope. These are folks who have dreams, and that's why they're here, because they think that they have a better shot at a better life, and they're not going to give up on their hopes and dreams, and we're not either.
President Trump has told those people to go to ports of entry. We spoke to Customs Border Protection. They gave us this statement late last night. It reads, in part, port of entry facilities were not designed to hold hundreds of people at a time who may be seeking asylum. We go ahead and flip the next one, guys. DHS is utilizing our limited resources as efficiently and effectively as possible in the midst of current surge. They add, the reality is unless Congress responds to our repeated requests for resources, we will continue to experience capacity changes. So if you are Jacqueline Call and her father, you have a choice. Do we go through the desert, which could be dangerous? Do we sit in Juarez, which we may never get out of this migrant center, which is also dangerous? Or do we go through Southern California, where we will inevitably now end up in a standoff between U.S. authorities and Mexican authorities? And speaking to Julia Ainsley, who's downstairs working the story and helped break it, we can't help think that this is what President Trump wants. These pictures around the world as a deterrent, and he's using cruelty as his message.
Well, everything we saw in your report is a result of the Trump policy.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And this is going to be the next chapter. We went through child separation. The next chapter is we don't have resources. Give us more resources, or these folks can't go anywhere.
Cal Perry, thank you very much for your invaluable reporting from the border. Really appreciate it. When we come back, what Donald Trump might now have to fear from some Republican senators. That's next. Here's more of what former FBI Director James Comey had to say today after he testified to a closed-door hearing organized by House Republicans.
Republicans used to understand that the actions of a president matter, the words of a president matter, the rule of law matters, and the truth matters. Where are those Republicans today? At some point, someone has to stand up and, in the face of fear of Fox News, fear of their base, fear of mean tweets, stand up for the values of this country and not slink away into retirement, but stand up and speak the truth.
And so the question now is, will Lamar Alexander slink away into retirement or stand up and speak the truth? Senator Alexander announced today he will not seek re-election to his Senate seat in Tennessee. We are likely to see a rerun in the Senate of what happened in the House of Representatives in the last election, a series of incumbent Republicans announcing they are not running for re-election. Might that mean that there will be stronger voices of opposition to Donald Trump in the Republican Senate than Jeff Flake and Bob Corker have been this year after announcing that they would not run for re-election? New polling shows Americans agree with James Comey that Donald Trump is not telling the truth. The Washington Post fact checker polled Americans on 11 prominent false statements by Donald Trump and found that, on average, fewer than 3 in 10 Americans and fewer than 4 in 10 Republicans actually believed those Trump false statements. The poll found 71% of Americans say Donald Trump regularly makes misleading claims. After a break, Jason Johnson and Jennifer Rubin will join us to consider the new political landscape in Congress, including what will probably be a large number of retiring Republican senators and what that might mean to Trump control of the United States Senate.
People who know better, including Republican members of this body, have to have the courage to stand up and speak the truth, not be cowed by mean tweets or fear of their base. There is a truth, and they're not telling it. Their silence is shameful.
Back with us, Jennifer Rubin and Jason Johnson. And Jennifer, I am fascinated by the first announced Republican retirement. There's 22 Republican seats up, so many more than Democrats. So we're going to have more Republicans announcing that they're not going to run for re-election. Each one of those Republicans is a potential danger to Donald Trump if they are no longer worried about appealing to Trump voters themselves.
although the Republicans didn't make progress in the Senate, in some ways, I think the Democrats didn't make progress. In some ways, I think the Democrats are much better positioned this time to push back. For one thing, one of those Republicans is Mitt Romney. Mm-hmm. We don't know how he's going to behave. We've been disappointed many times before, but he could decide, hey, what have I got to lose? I'm here. This is the capstone of my career. I could be independent. I could stand up to this guy. I could absolutely see him playing that role. You have people like Lamar Alexander, who was always a moderate, who was always a deal maker. He got a renewal of No Child Left Behind through the Senate, for example. He's always been someone who Democrats liked and kind of a gentleman in the same way that Bob Corker was. So you could see him. And then you have a handful of Republicans who are in purple or blue states, a Cory Gardner from Colorado, who's going to be in a lot of trouble. So I think you have a nucleus of 5 or 6 senators there on the Republican side who Donald Trump is not necessarily going to be able to count on. And that's going to play a huge role in confirmation of appointees as these people go out the door or have to resign in disgrace. It's going to mean legislation. It's going to mean, in some instances, Republicans cooperating with investigations, whereas they did not do so in the past. So I think as we watch Donald Trump's bubble burst and as he careens out of control, becomes more and more hysterical, his poll numbers go down, the country is drifting, they're not getting their agenda through, I think you could see a mini revolt. I don't suppose that they're going to do anything extraordinary, but little steps lead to bigger steps, and bigger steps lead to who knows what.
That is true. And Jason Johnson, I think people often forget that the Senate Intelligence Committee is functioning as a bipartisan committee. Right. And with Republican support on that committee, they released these 2 very important reports today about Russian interference in the vote and how they targeted various voters in trying to discourage those voters. And so you have a nucleus there on the Senate Intelligence Committee that could spread as the evidence against the Trump administration mounts through Democratic-run congressional hearings in the House.
Right, Lawrence, the Senate has always played a very interesting role when it comes to the 2016 election. On the one hand, they won't protect Robert Mueller, right? They could pass a bill and make sure that Trump can't get rid of him. But on the other hand, they've been slowly but surely continuing the investigation into election interference in a way that the House has not. And I think as that evidence becomes more apparent, and also as people begin to realize Trump can't save you. Trump won't save you, right? And every man and woman is going to have to be for themselves. Not just Cory Gardner in Colorado, but Susan Collins is going to be in trouble. These senators are looking at what happened in 2018. They're looking at having had to defend Kavanaugh. They're looking at what could be a cratering economy. They're looking at scandal after scandal, and they're realizing that support for this president is not going to be beneficial. I agree with Comey. I wish more of these senators would stay and actually stand up for democracy instead of taking their ball and going home. But as they leave, it makes it harder for the existing Republicans to pretend that the Washington, D.C. isn't burning around this incompetent president.
And let's not overlook, Jennifer, this Republican Senate rebuke, joined by Democrats, of the Trump policy of basically cover-up on Saudi Arabia and the killing of Khashoggi.
Absolutely. There were 2 steps, actually. One was to directly blame Mohammed bin Salman in contradiction of the president, directly finger him after these embarrassingly non-credible briefings that they received from Mike Pompeo and from Jim Mattis. And the other was to actually take back power from the White House, to actually act within the context of the war powers and say, we will not consent to the use of our forces in Yemen, where a genocidal situation is building. It was extraordinary. That was a real rebuke, maybe the first actual legislative rebuke this president has received from Republicans.
Yeah, and so, Jason, the question is just, how good did that feel to those Republican senators? Hey, did that feel good? Because there's more if you want to.
I mean, I hope they recognize, like, well, wait, we have a job here. Right. Like, you can go back and you can actually rebuke this president. But I think the other thing is this, Lawrence, for so long, you had all these battles between Obama and the Senate and who's got more power and control. The Senate recognizes that they are an actual equal branch of our government, and they have an opportunity to set precedent and set policy, and they don't have to go down the drain with the President of the United States. And I think increasingly people are also recognizing that, look, with 17 investigations, as you mentioned, mentioned, these investigations are eventually going to land in their laps, and the American people are going to demand accountability from the Senate in an oversight perspective. So I expect to see more of this going forward. I am not sure if I think that the president is going to get primaried yet, but I do believe this. If his numbers by the fall of 2019 are hovering regularly below 40%, I think a Bob Corker, I think a Lamar Alexander, I think not necessarily a Mitt Romney, but he will encourage people behind the scenes. We may see this president get primaried, and the most likely location for the person who's going to do that is going to be from the U.S. Senate.
And Jennifer, Bob Corker said today, he thinks it's, I'm quoting him, he says, I think it's important to remind people that we're going through an anomaly right now as it relates to much of the standard Republican focus. And he's saying he is hoping that there will be a Republican primary against Donald Trump.
In her own weak little way, Susan Collins also said she wouldn't be opposed to primary candidates. There you go. That's about as bold as you're going to get from Susan Collins.
There's the crack in the wall.